Hi, I'm Rob Cosman. Welcome to my shop. In our ongoing series on furniture making for beginners, today we're going to talk about doors. Now that's any kind of a slab that is hinged, that's designed to cover an open space. There's a lot to think about. It has a huge impact on how your piece looks. I'm going to give you some ideas. Stay with us. I'm Rob Cosman and welcome to my shop. We make it our job to help take your woodworking to the next level. If you're new and you haven't subscribed, please do so. Hit the notification bell so you'll receive alerts when we release a new video. And anytime we use a special tool, we'll always leave a description down below. All right, let's get to work. Most cabinets or furniture that have doors or a door, that usually takes up a good portion of the overall look of the piece. And that's why I said you really need to pay attention to how you design the door, what it's made of, how it fits, all of those things. So now, a lot of videos you see on doors are going to show you how to make a particular door that person likes. What I'm going to do in this video is show you the options, a lot of them. I've collected several doors from in the shop and at home. We're going to go through and I'm going to show you them. I'm going to give you some information on what you need to consider. And hopefully, as you go through this, you'll be able to make that decision based on the information you've received. And in future videos, we're actually going to go in and we're going to show you how to make several different styles of door. We'll do one door in each video. And with a little bit of luck, you'll be doing it yourself. Let's talk a little bit about the different types of doors. Now, I don't mean the actual door itself. What I'm referring to is how does that door fit to the cabinet? Not with hinges, but how does it actually sit on the surface of the cabinet? My favorite, I'm going to discuss first, is what we would call an inset or a flush mount door. What we mean by that is that when the door is closed, it's flush with the face of the cabinet. This is the one that I use, and even in my shop furniture, if you look over here. And probably the biggest feature is nobody can slam a door because of that cushion of air that it closes on. I also like it because I think it's the best way to demonstrate your craftsmanship when it comes to doors. That little gap has to be precise all the way around. If it's off even the slightest, it's noticeable, so it really is going to test you. Probably not where the average person is going to want to start, but certainly it's where you're going to want to end up. I think that if you're going to make doors, why not do them the very best job you can? Why not get that fit so it's so precise that, as I said, you cannot slam the door? All right, on to number 2. So from the most difficult to the easiest. This is what you typically find on a lot of kitchen cabinets because there's no great level of precision as long as the door covers the opening. This sits on the surface. You don't want to have any gaps where you can see in behind, but whether it covers it by 1/2 inch or 1/4 inch doesn't really matter. Now, if I was doing this, I would want to have it the same extra width as it was the extra length. And if you have 2 doors meeting, you're going to want to pay attention to this gap so that it's uniform top to bottom. But this is really easy to do. If you're just getting started, this is probably the one that you're going to want to start with. Not difficult. This is the full overlay. This third style or type of door is called a half overlay or an inset. And it has a rabbet that goes all the way around the perimeter of the door. Actually, I had to take an old door and create it. I don't do this. I think it's very dated. That may be just my opinion, but you don't tend to see it very often anymore. And unlike the full overlay that sits on the surface, this one is designed to sit partially in there. I suppose it looks a little bit neater, but like I said, I think it's rather dated. And you obviously have to have specific hardware to do it. And it does require a little more precision, but not a ton, because the fit of that inside part with this, it doesn't need to be very, very precise. This last one we'll call 3.5 because it's really a kind of a combination of a few things. It's a full overlay, but it's on what we would call a frameless cabinet. So instead of having a face frame that sits on, there's no frame on the cabinet. The door simply sits there, so you would have your doors, if it was a cabinet or a kitchen cabinet, your doors would all be butted against each other and you wouldn't see any of the carcass behind it. Again, another one of those easier ones to do. You do have to pay attention to the amount of space you have all the way around, but rather simple. Now, talking about the actual construction of the door, there's essentially two types. There's a slab and there's a frame and panel. And either of these types of doors can be used in any of those 3.5 styles we talked about. What you're trying to do with your door is to create a flat panel of some sort that's going to stay nice and flat and is going to allow for any seasonal movement and hopefully fit nice in your cabinet for years to come. Okay, let's take a look at slab doors first. Now, the absolute simplest is nothing more than a board. Now, the problem with that is it may or may not stay flat. Boards have a tendency to cup as the environment around them either gets drier or more humid, and the board is either going to absorb or give off moisture, always seeking equilibrium, and that may sometimes cause that board to cup. Well, sometimes you can live with it, sometimes you can't. Of course, the wider the board is, the more it's going to cup. So if you were to go from this being the absolute simplest to the next, you could add what's called a batten. So there's your solid wood door, and on the inside, you would put a piece of wood. Now we know wood is much stronger across its width than it is, across its length than it is across its width. I could break that quite easily that way, but it would be very difficult to break that way. So if the board cups, you can actually straighten it out without a lot of effort. So what you do is take a solid piece of wood like this. Now there's 3 holes just because of the width of this board. The center one is a lot smaller than the outside ones. So if I were to put 3 screws, now remember this is the simplest way. That screw in the middle is not going to allow for any movement. And I would fasten that in. And then these 2 screws would go in a hole that's a little bit bigger, and that would allow a little bit of room for this piece underneath to expand and contract seasonally without restricting it and causing it to split. So that would be the next simplest way to keep a simple slab door, solid wood door, from cupping. A little more sophisticated way would be to make what we call a breadboard end. So again, we're taking advantage of the fact that wood is very strong across its length, and we have a matching tongue fitting into a groove, and we would put that on there. We would secure it in the middle with glue, possibly even pin it. It could be with a small wooden dowel, or you could just use nothing but glue, and the rest of it is going to float. So I might glue that much of it. The rest of this is just allowed to float, so the board will grow or it'll shrink depending on the surrounding atmosphere. Sometimes this will be flush, sometimes it'll actually stick out a little bit, sometimes it'll actually be sunk in, but it will help to keep that door nice and flat. And it can actually be a bit decorative. If we go up from there, then there's all kinds of things that we can do when it comes to man-made goods. Here's an example. Now this is a piece of 5/8 inch MDF. That stands for medium density fiberboard, very stable product. That's what the inner core is. On either side, I've glued a piece of mahogany veneer, very thin wood, and then to hide those bare edges, in this case I use bird's eye maple so that this would match my tool cabinet that we're building. This will stay nice and flat. I've reinforced the corners with some splines, and of course I dressed it up a little bit with the bird's eye. So there's a way of making a flat panel called a slab, decorative, nice and stable. Here's another example, only this time we've used actually a piece of plywood. So we have a piece of white oak plywood, and we have trimmed it with white oak, solid white oak, all the way around the perimeter. And this will most likely stay nice and flat. You've got a good glue joint between the edge of the plywood and the solid wood. You don't see the edge of the plywood. It also allows you to dress it up with any kind of edge treatment. In this case, there's just a little bead all the way around there. Not a very fancy way of doing it, but certainly a way. Here's something I dug out of my basement, a piece of furniture that got destroyed by water. But here's another piece of MDF covered in what's called fiddleback ash. So what I did in this case was I took that piece of 1/2 inch MDF, and before I put the veneer on it, front and back, I took a solid piece of, you can actually see up here at the end, I took a solid piece of ash and I glued probably a 1/2 inch by 1/2 inch on either end, and then I glued 2 stronger strips on either long edge. Then I sandwiched that between 2 pieces of veneer. So if you you have to look close to see there's actually a glue joint there, but it looks like a solid piece of wood. But instead of behaving like a solid piece of wood where it would most likely cup, this over the years, and I built this probably 30 years ago anyway, this has stayed nice and flat, even though it was down in a damp basement. So, and you can do lots of things with slabs. It really opens up tremendous possibilities. What I like most about it is the stability factor. That's your slab door. All right, our next category is frame and panel. This is my favorite. This has been around for centuries, and it's a great way to build a cabinet. You can use it for the sides as well as the doors. Let me explain it first. So what you have is a frame made up of wood, mostly in its length, so the pieces tend to be relatively narrow, and that because wood is stable in its length, you have a door that in this case is not going to get any longer and is not going to get any wider. Most of the width of this door is comprised of wood in its length. There is a little bit in its width here and here, but it's relatively small. So you have this nice big stable panel. Obviously you have to have some kind of a strong joint holding it together. And then inside you have the unstable piece of wood. I say unstable meaning this board this wide is going to want to move, expand and contract, but it's held in a groove. It's not restricted from expanding and contracting, and that way it'll stay nice and stable in terms of the overall dimensions of the door, all the while this panel is actually shrinking and expanding seasonally. So let me show you a couple of examples. First of all, this one. This is actually just a sample that I did up. So this utilizes what we call a tongue and groove. So this piece on a door is referred to as the rail. So the pieces that run horizontally are rails. Pieces that run vertically are the stiles. And typically you're going to have the two rails captured in between the two stiles at the end. And this is where your joint comes in. So we have a tongue attached to the rail that goes into a matching groove, the full length of the stile, and that same groove runs all the way around the inside of all four pieces, and that's what the panel sits in. When you make this, you always have to make sure that those grooves are deeper than the panel is wide. So when you put it together, there's always going to be a little extra space at the bottom of the groove that will allow for that panel to expand and contract. You don't want too much because it'll still blow it apart if it expands too much, and you don't want it to be too close fitting because this may shrink and pull out of the groove and you'd see a crack through there. Now a wise thing to do is to center the panel in the frame and then pin it right in the middle, top and bottom. You can use a small dowel, you can use a small nail, and that means all of the expansion will then go equal distance from center. So instead of sliding all the way one side or the other, which may open up a gap, it will always go the same amount in both directions. So that's a tongue and groove, and that's a pretty strong joint. If you consider anywhere long grain, this stuff, touches other long grain, it's going to be stronger than the wood itself. And you've got a lot of long grain to long grain contact, and this is a fairly long tongue, so this is a good strong joint. Let's show another one. Here's one, quite a bit different. Now this is also a frame and panel. However, the panel is a piece of plywood, which tends to be very stable itself. But the joint is actually a miter joint, and then it's strengthened by having two splines. These are plywood splines. The groove has been cut all the way through. Two of them actually. Makes extremely strong, improves the leverage. Those plywood splines are glued in place, and this becomes a very, very strong joint. And the nice thing about having a miter is that you can carry any kind of a decorative edge treatment all the way around the inside. If you were to do it over here, when your edge treatment ends up coming in, bumping into the end of this, it doesn't flow very well at all. On a miter, it can go all the way around the inside. Easy to do. Here's another one. Now this is another joint that's also very strong. This is a bridle joint, so you see the tongue on this rail that you can see it all the way through. There's a lot of glue surface between this piece and this side of the tongue and that piece and this side of the tongue. A very, very strong joint. Has a solid wood panel, and it's not sticking up. It's actually flush with the surface, and it just has a little reveal all the way around. Again, this is sitting into a groove. The groove on these two styles are deeper than this panel is wide, which will allow for that expansion and contraction. Pinned in the middle, so when it pulls in, and that's really important in a situation like this, where you have a very narrow groove. So if that groove were to be a little bit narrower on one side than the other, it would actually show quite easily. So you want to always make sure that you pin your panels right in the center. All right, let's pull out another one. Here's a very common one, particularly in mass-produced doors. So this is a coped joint. This is done with a pair of shaper cutters or router cutters that one cuts the negative, one cuts the positive. Doesn't have a ton of glue surface if you think about it. Oftentimes these will be strengthened with 1 or 2 dowels to give a little more strength to that joint. And again, it allows for a groove all the way around, and that solid wood panel is allowed to expand and contract. Same as before, you always want to pin your panels in the middle. This is pretty standard fare on mass-produced kitchen cabinets. Now, let's have one more, and then I'm going to show you my favorite of all. So this is a glass frame and panel. However, the panel is a piece of glass. Now, what I did in this case, this had to be a really strong joint because it's a fairly large door. It's made out of pine. So it's actually thicker than most. This is 7/8 of an inch thick, and it has that big open bridle joint, so lots of surface area for the long grain to long grain glue contact, and then you've got a glass panel that's held in with silicone. So that is a nice stable door as well. Now here's my favorite, and this is where you really get to show off your joinery skills. So this is a frame and panel door as well, but the joint is something called a through wedge tenon. What you're looking at right here is part of this rail that goes all the way through. The hole that we've cut in the style is called a mortise. It's actually shaped somewhat like a V. So this piece, which is what you see right here, before we put it through, we make 2 cuts near the edge. We put it through, and then we drive in this case, walnut wedges. And those walnut wedges fill that shape between the straight-sided tenon that comes through and those slope sides in the mortise. And when you do that, the glue makes these 5 pieces all one, and it creates what we would call an internal dovetail, extremely strong. And I also carried out a little bit of a tongue right there, and what that does is just provide additional strength up in this part of the joint, because that tenon would have ended somewhere back here. So by doing that, you're also making it easier to cut this groove that has to go all the way around on all 4 pieces to house the panel, but it also gives it a little more strength, so it doesn't have any wiggle room side to side. And that panel is simple. Now what I did here is I put a little chamfer all on the inside and just ended it just before you got to the corner. That was the advantage I mentioned on a mitered frame. You could carry that all the way around. Instead of having to cut into here, which makes it look a little bit awkward, I just kept it back about 3/4 of an inch. And then I kind of duplicated that on the sides of this panel where it's just slightly beveled. Lots of fun making these doors, but there's a lot of work in them. So there's lots of different variations on a frame and panel, but do whatever you want. When it comes to a frame and panel, you have lots of options with the panel. You can get really creative. I'm just going to show you some of the common examples. This is probably the simplest and probably the most common. This is just a flat panel. It's actually a piece of 1/4 inch plywood. Nice thing about that is you cut the plywood, sand it, put it in there. You don't have to worry about expansion. It fits in the groove. What I don't like about it is kind of hollow sounding. Not what I would call really good quality for fine furniture. Then you look over here. This is what we would call a flush panel or a solid panel. It's solid wood. It's flush with the sides of the frame. It doesn't stick up above. There's just a little reveal all the way around, allowing for seasonal movement. Simple but elegant. This is a piece of glass, and you can use clear glass, you could use frosted glass, you could use stained glass, all kinds of options, because you've got a nice stable panel to put that in. Over here we have something that would be called a raised panel. So this has a treatment all the way around, and this actually sits up above the frame. So if you were to look down there, you'll see that it sticks up about 1/8 of an inch higher. And then over here, we have what's the English would call a fielded panel. Kind of similar idea, only it sits down, it's flush with the frame itself. And there's lots of different edge treatments that you can do in this panel. This is just a bevel that's cut all the way around there with the center section slightly raised, and just gives it some depth. But you can put an OG in there, you can, all kinds of different profiles. Each one of them, depending on how involved they are, is going to require a lot more work. You're sanding end grain when you're preparing that, and that's not the easiest thing to do. It's fairly time consuming. So these are the various doors. What we're going to do in future episodes is we're actually going to go in and we're going to pick several of these and show you how to make them. We'll go one at a time, teach you everything you need to know. You'll be able to do it. If you enjoy my method of work and like my style of teaching, click on any one of these videos to help take your woodworking to the next level. Now, I've always said, better tools make the job so much easier. If you click on the icon with the plane and the chisel, it'll take you to our website, introduce you to all of our tools that we actually manufacture right here, as well as our workshops, both in person and online. Good luck.